Hi and welcome to this overview tutorial on VR Tunneling Pro. I'm Luke, lead programmer at SigTrap Games. I'm going to show you how to set up VRTP and how to use most of the major features. This tutorial assumes you've seen the intro video, so I'm just going to dive straight into how to set up VRTP in your own projects. Since VRTP is an image effect, it can be added on top of any VR project, so I'm just going to use a stripped down version of the example scene that we include in the package. The first step is just to attach the script to the camera object. Note that we've also got tunneling opaque and tunneling mobile as options. I'm just going to use the standard tunneling effect for now, but if you're targeting mobile hardware, then the mobile version is a better option. This is a very high performance variant which doesn't use post-processing. Tunneling opaque is very similar to the standard tunneling effect, except that it draws before any transparent and UI elements. Now that the script is on the camera object, all we need to do now is hook up the motion target. As described before, in this case, this should be the player. Now, if we hit play, we can see that immediately the tunneling effect is working. So this is essentially all we need to do for the default setup. Of course, VRTP gives us a lot of different options on how to fine-tune the effect. So let's have a look at some of those now. First off, I'm going to look at the debug options here. So we have a really useful tool in here called Force Effect. So instead of waiting for motion, this just overrides the motion calculation to give the effect a constant value. This means we don't have to be moving around to fine-tune what we want the effect to look like. If I now play around with the effect coverage and the effect feather settings, you can see how the vignette changes. So increasing the effect feather is nice to give a more gradual edge to the effect. This will make it a little less intrusive for players who find it distracting. Don't worry too much though, because when you're in VR, this is a lot less obvious than it seems on screen. We can also change the color of the effect, and if we change the alpha value, then the opacity goes down. Let's look quickly at the motion settings. So by default, we just have angular velocity, i.e. turn rate, as this is the strongest driver of sim sickness for most players. I'll turn off Force Effect and start moving around so we can see how this changes the effect. We can change how much angular velocity contributes to the effect. We can also set the minimum and maximum values. Below the minimum value, the motion is ignored, and then above the max value, we cap the effect. We can also change the smoothing time. If this is not smooth, then you're going to find that sometimes you're going to get big jumps, which is going to cause the effect to stutter. So we can smooth out the motion, and we've given it a solid default of 0.15 seconds. As well as angular velocity, you can also use acceleration and velocity. For some projects and some sort of motion, and particularly for some players, these sorts of motion are going to cue sim sickness as well. They all have the same settings as angular velocity, and they can all be turned on and off independently. We've got another useful tool in the debug options here called the Motion Analyzer. This looks at the motion that the effect is detecting, so you can fine-tune the minimum and maximum values on each type of motion. You can see that we've got the current value of the motion, and it also stores the peak motion, so this is useful for setting the maximum value. You can reset any of these by pressing the reset button, and that'll put the peak back down to 0 again. For looking at the other settings, I'm going to switch back to Force Effect mode so that we don't have to move around. Background mode determines what's drawn in the vignette. In the basic mode, color, this just draws the effect color. Now if we switch to Skybox, then we're drawing that cube map. Obviously we now have the option to choose a cube map, and I've chosen a default one here, which again is one of the ones that we include for you. If I click Apply Color, then you can see the Skybox is tinted with the effect color. Note that the basic settings stay the same, so the effect coverage and the effect feather still drive what the vignette looks like, and this is true of all background modes. Now we're going to look at the cage modes. These are a little more complex than the Skybox mode. The first one, Cage Color, allows us to draw 3D objects with a colored background. The second, Cage Skybox, does the same but draws a skybox behind instead of just a plain color. In both cases we have the Cage Parent field. This is a parent game object under which you put all the objects you want to be drawn in the cage. This object and all its children will get turned off automatically during rendering, so they don't get rendered into the world, and VRTP controls rendering them to a render texture. Generally, the cage parent should itself be parented to the object driving the motion, in this case player. So a good rule of thumb is that it should be parented to the motion target. This means it stays static in the player's real-world frame of reference. The fog parameters here allow us to apply fog to objects in the cage. This is independent of Unity's fog settings, so you can have a different fog in the world and in the cage itself. This requires that we use custom shaders that are included in VRTP for you. If you go to VR Tunneling Pro, Cage, transparent fogged, or opaque fogged, these shaders will receive fog in the cage. Note that regardless of what you put in the cage, they have to use unlit shaders. There is no lighting rendered in the cage. To keep draw calls down, it's a good idea to use combined meshes in the cage. We've included a few prefabs for you, so if you go to VR Tunneling Pro, Prefabs, Cages, you can see the examples we have. The one I'm using here is the Comfort Cubes prefab. We've also got a radial arrangement called Comfort Cubes Polar, and we've got a simple cuboid grid which is really good for vehicles where you have a defined direction of motion. We've also got performance settings for the cage, so for instance we can change the anti-aliasing. It's currently on auto, which means it uses the quality settings, and we can set the downsampling, which means that the cage will use a lower resolution than the rest of the game. The final background mode is blur. So instead of drawing something over the periphery, what we're actually doing here is blurring it out. For players with moderate tolerance who find the other settings intrusive, this can be a really nice option. As you can see, this mode takes more performance than the others, and we have a lot of optimization and effect settings. So we can downsample the blur, increase the radius, change the number of samples, and set the number of passes. Now we'll look at the mask settings. If we change the mask mode to mask, then what this will do is exclude specific objects from the effect. To exclude objects, we just add a tunneling mask object script to them. If auto add children is selected, then it'll also add child objects to the mask. And note that if we disable the script, the object is no longer masked, and if we enable it again, it is. Masking is great for cockpits, bodies, arms, anything that stays static relative to the player. These objects already help form a static reference frame for the player, so there's no need to have them in the effect. Note that if I change the background mode, masking is still applied. The mask mode and the background mode are completely independent of each other and can be used in any combination. Now I'm going to switch to window mode. Notice that now the cage is everywhere except on the masked object. In this mode, mask objects define where the VR world is shown. In other words, a window into the VR world. This allows us to give the cage as a constant reference frame, regardless of movement. The motion vignette will also override the window, meaning that both modes are combined. Of course, we can turn this off by turning off all the use motion settings. Note that there's still full stereoscopy and depth perception in the VR window. The final mask mode is portal. This is the opposite of window in that the effect is drawn onto masked objects. This is useful for making world space portals in the VR world that show through to the cage. This helps establish the cage as the true reference frame for the player. As before, when we move, the vignette comes in from the corners as well, and as before, we can turn this off. One of the reasons that VRTP has so many options is that different players respond to different settings. One might prefer blur over skybox, and another might need higher motion sensitivity settings. So it's always a good idea to give players a lot of comfort options in VR games. But with so many options to choose from, this can be daunting both for the player to know what each one does, and for you as the developer to offer that functionality. To make this as simple as possible, VRTP includes a comprehensive preset system. Presets are assets which can be made in editor and then applied at runtime. This gives you a simple system to preload presets and let the user choose between them. Almost all options can be changed with presets, with a few notable exceptions such as motion target and cage parent. On the right of each setting is a tick box. If this box is ticked, when the preset is applied, that setting will be overridden by the preset value. If it's not ticked, then the setting will be ignored. This means that you can compose partial presets, for instance one that only changes motion settings or another that only changes background settings. This can really help players fine-tune the settings they want to use. Referencing and applying presets is only a few lines of code. In this example class, I'm just declaring some public tunneling presets, and then in this method I'm applying one of them. Note that the tunneling and tunneling opaque scripts both use a tunneling preset, whereas tunneling mobile needs a separate tunneling mobile preset. Hopefully that's given you a good overview of VR Tunneling Pro and how to use it in your project. There's lots more information in our documentation, and if you've got any questions, please check out our Unity forum thread. Thanks for watching.